disinformation and misinformation are harmful and a very topical question for us. We have been in the midst of a pandemic where disinformation and misinformation have had a real impact. And looking back from the perspective of the ODI, where we want data to get to people who need it to make better decisions, it would be easy to think that data and technology are part of the problem when it comes to disinformation and misinformation. They are things that speed up and scale up the dis and misinformation. In this panel today, I have gathered three absolutely wonderful, smart people, and I'm going to basically ask them about their perspective, their experience, their knowledge about whether data is part of the problem, part of the solution, or a little bit of both. So I would like you to meet my three panelists, starting with Sana Beg. Sana is a head of communications at Doctors Without Borders, for French speakers like me, Medecins Sans Frontières in South Asia. Sana, I wanted to start with you and hear a little bit about your experience at Doctors Without Borders and how your work touches upon the question of disinformation and misinformation, how you tackle it, how you see it, and how you and your work fight against dis and misinformation.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Olivier, for having me. As you mentioned, I'm sure many of you know of our organization already, but I wanted to take this moment to also introduce who we are. We, as Doctors Without Borders, we're an international medical humanitarian organization. We work in over 70 countries across the world, providing emergency medical care to those who need it most. That's in conflicts, in natural or man-made disasters, for people who are excluded or are on the margins of receiving healthcare in their countries. And we do all of this free of cost. We do all of this in an independent, neutral, impartial way with the highest regard for medical ethics across the world, wherever we work. And another thing that we do is we also bear witness to what we see, because our work often puts us at the front lines of situations that often even the media doesn't have access to. And so we speak out about situations that often that we see firsthand because of the responsibility that we see to the people that we seek to help. I am the head of communications for our movement in South Asia. And South Asia, as we may have seen also in the recent Facebook papers that have been revealed, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation coming out of this region. Not just that, in a lot of the humanitarian contexts where we work, simply put, what we are seeing is that misinformation and disinformation can kill. We are seeing, I think the COVID-19 pandemic in particular brought with it a lot of medical, scientific, health-related misinformation. And a lot of that has been riding on that uncertainty and doubt created, of course, by what we are still trying to figure out about this, about COVID-19. But we have seen it impacting our healthcare workers. We're seeing real elements such as vaccine hesitancy. Our frontline workers tell us directly that vaccine hesitancy, for example, is directly related to misinformation or disinformation that they're seeing people being on the receiving end of. And not just with COVID-19, in conflict situations, the way we are perceived as a humanitarian medical organization in this era of, along with COVID-19, but also criminalization of the aid sector in many ways. We work with refugees, we work with people who may not have a voice of their own. And with that comes a lot of misinformation and disinformation directly targeted at us, directly targeted at our workers. To answer your question about what are we doing in particular, so in addition to my role as head of comms, I'm part of a unique team that we have created in MSF, recognizing that this is something that us in the humanitarian sector really need to get ahead of. As much as we are an emergency medical humanitarian organization and we're excellent at being there immediately when a crisis hits, we really didn't have any measures or workflows in place on how to address the threats that we see in the virtual space that seem to have a real measurable impact on the offline space as well for us. So we've piloted a couple of projects. A group of us across the MSF movement, across the world, are working together at this stage to figure out how best to tackle misinfo and disinfo as it relates to us and how it impacts our work. I can get more into it now, but maybe checking with you on the, okay. A couple of things that we're doing. We have something called MSF Listen. It's a pilot program we've started for now in Somalia and Afghanistan. It's a software, and it's an implied workflow of sorts to manage misinfo in MSF projects. While rumor gathering has been an offline activity for us for a long time, it's typically carried out by health promotion teams. We are now looking through this tool that we've piloted called MSF Listen to digitize rumor collection and build institutional memory for ourselves of these rumors. It also gives us an opportunity to have a more comprehensive approach to managing misinformation in particular, and promote collaboration between teams who may not be speaking to each other otherwise. Like I said, we're trying it in Somalia and Afghanistan at the moment. We're hoping to expand it further. On the disinformation side of things, we're working with colleagues that we have within the MSF movement on a digital side, trying to support our field missions on how to assess disinformation cases. We have a pool of super reporters that are equipped and skilled on how to handle these situations. We're helping our field staff know how to assess and first and foremost, recognize that what's happening in the virtual space is having that real impact on them. So really trying through trial and error to change our own user behavior within our movement as well, to recognize this and get ahead of the problem. So I'll keep it at that for now and go more in detail later.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sana. And thanks so much for contextualizing it and really giving a vivid and important account of how disinformation permeates the online and offline space and how at scale and how the impact, which just to some of us in the audience today might seem a little bit abstract, but it is a concrete thing. One of the things that I was thinking when you were talking about the work that you're doing is that from the perspective of people working in data, there may be a notion that, well, yes, it is a technological problem, but really it's all about content, it's about information, it's about interaction. What has data to do with this? And so I wanted to turn to our second panelist today, Elena Simperl, Professor Elena Simperl of the Department of Informatics at King's College London. Elena, you are an expert at the intersection of the social science and technology, and your work has been touching upon how people interact with information, interact with data. And so I wanted to ask you perhaps a facetious question of what does this have to do with data, really, that notion of disinformation and misinformation and how people interact with information that is presented to them on those big platforms or elsewhere?
Yes, thank you. And that's actually an excellent question. No controversy at all. I'm very glad to be here at the summit, and congratulations again on an excellent event. What does data have to do with misinformation and disinformation? What do people have to do with it? Well, first and foremost, data is a product of people's work. We might see it as a product of technologies, if we deploy sensors, if we post pictures on social media and so on and so forth. But ultimately, those technologies are designed and set up and configured and managed by people. So in my research, I am trying to make sense of this intersection, as you've called it. One example, perhaps that is most pertinent, is in open online databases that are used in information tasks like in question answering, in chatbots, in intelligent assistants. They're fueled by these common good, openly available data sets and databases that are created virtually by everyone and anyone in the world, right? So there's examples like most recently Wikidata, which is a database that is used among others to fuel most of the info boxes. So the factual information that you see on the right hand side of every Wikipedia, or many Wikipedia articles. So that data is created by an open community, which is great because it means that you can create large amounts of data very quickly. It also means that potentially lots of people are looking at the same bits of information and can potentially update them and spot mistakes. But just like these are all advantages of what we call collective intelligence or the wisdom of the crowds, there's also many dangers, like a small minority of editors or members of this community taking control through various means, taking control of the data sets, or more nuanced biases that their backgrounds or their tenure or their expertise could create unintentionally. So part of my research really is to ask the question, how do people make data? How do people make information? What is the relationship between someone's background and interests and expertise and motivation on the data sets that we are using extensively? Related to that, in the context of Wikipedia, it's also worth mentioning that lots of the data that is stored there is meant to be a secondary source of information. So it is not information that is created firsthand by that community, but it is information that it is published elsewhere in a primary source and needs to be referenced. So the quality of those references, of those sources, some of them more relevant or more authoritative than others, is important as well. And part of our research is to understand how people pick these references and how the choice of references impacts as well on the applications. For instance, the Alexas, Google Home and Siris of this world that consume this information, how do these references impact the use of the information down the line? The other part of my research is spent more in the area of human data interaction, with the assumption that if we perhaps reflect upon and rethink how people, the public, casually interacts with information, for instance, on social media, in the news, and so on and so forth, and if we find ways to represent and communicate data beyond the usual spreadsheets and charts, we might perhaps make it easier or more informative or more entertaining for people to spot good data, to understand what a data set is about and use it effectively. So in Data Stories, which was a research project where we collaborated with you and other people at the ODI, we've asked ourselves, what do people need to know about a source of data? For instance, a simple question was, if you were to describe a complex source of data in 100 words, what would you put in that summary? And that is a source of misinformation in itself, because as we know, a summary can be reductive in more than one way, and there's a whole field that is looking at how to create informative summaries of complex information. But beyond that, we've also looked at games or other means to represent data sets in unusual ways. We've looked at arts-inspired approaches that would take a data set or someone's experience with a data set and communicate it in ways that appeal to the wider public. And in that context, I'm very happy that I am currently involved in a European initiative called Media Futures, and we have a booth presenting some of our work here at the summit today, where we reached out to the wider creative industries and artists community, and we have asked them, how should we communicate disinformation and misinformation aspects, for instance, in science education, for instance, in quality journalism, to the wider public. And we've worked so far with 19 startups and artists from all over Europe who responded to 3 challenges we have identified with the help of the community. One of them was looking for new concepts for data literacy. The other one was asking for ways to build bridges across communities that are polarized and fragmented, that perhaps do not interact with each other online as much as they should. And finally, the third challenge was around establishing trustworthy mediators that would perhaps structure and organize the huge amounts of information that are available online, and present it in ways that make sense and is trusted at the same time by the public. And if you visit the booth, you will experience some of these wonderful works as well. And I think I'm going to leave it at that, and give you a few more details further down the line in the panel. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Elena. You've just given me an excellent segue also to our third panelist. You were talking about, oh, I forgot the exact term you used, but a trustworthy information intermediary. So my third panelist in this session today is Andy Dudfield of the charity Full Fact. And Andy, so I was wondering if you could introduce yourself, introduce the work that you're doing, because you know we've had some really interesting forays, and Elena was talking just earlier about the quality of the data. Sana was talking about the efforts to understand it, the extent of misinformation, disinformation, and counter it, and you know the work that you are doing is very much about finding good data and presenting it to counter misinformation. And spoiler, we've got some really interesting questions in the Q&A on the sidebar of the event. That's great. I encourage everyone in the audience to add to it. We are going to be channeling your questions to the panelists. But first, Andy, would you like to talk to you about your experience and your perspective, please?
Sure, thanks, Olivier. So yes, my name is Andy Dudfield, and my job title is Head of Automated Fact Checking, which is a very cool job title. And I work at an organisation called Full Fact. It's a charity in the UK that's been going about 11 years. And I'm really tired because I've been working at Full Fact for about 2 years. The idea was to get through a general election and then we'd sort of take stock. Got through a general election, and then we've been fact checking a global pandemic for the last 18 months, which is quite a difficult thing to have done. And I think one of the things that I wanted to pick up on was partly around the point that Sana made at the start. I think it's really important about the power of bad information. I think it is manifestly, it can ruin lives. It can damage people's health, and it can hurt democracy. And these are pretty foundational things that we're dealing with. And I think the concepts we're dealing with here are huge. And secondly, I think it's really interesting to think about scale. So fact checking, Full Fact have been around for 11 years. That's quite a long time as a fact checker. All fact checkers around the world have created 100,000 fact checks ever. And that's a number that we're really proud of. That's a really big number, and as a community we should be really proud of that. But also that's 100,000 pieces of information versus the rest of the web, and at that point it becomes an incredibly tiny number. And I think it's an interesting point to consider the web as a medium, I suppose, and about how good information fits into it in this data landscape of there is no center, there is no bit where the good information exists, and fact checking isn't about that. Fact checking is providing claims with some information that people can review and decide if they agree with them or not. But certainly I think one of the most important things is to think about scale, and a lot of our work is about how do we intermediate the information that we publish into other platforms. And I think this is perhaps touches on some more traditional ODI style subjects of decent web schemas, open style data, making sure we're following markup and open web standards to ensure that we can treat a fact check as a content type. It's as a unit of information that can be intermediated into other platforms and is. So we see our content appearing on Facebook, we see our content appearing in YouTube, and we see our content appearing in search results. And that's where the vast majority of people consume fact checks. It's hundreds of millions of people will see these in these different platforms. And I think there's a really interesting thing about making sure that when data is published, you're thinking about where it can be used. And there's a positivity to a relatively small set of data being seen an extraordinarily large amount of time. That scale is just tremendously important. Part of my work is to work with fact checkers around the world, particularly Africa Check based a number of countries in Africa, and Chequiado in Argentina, to use technology to try and help out with the processes of fact checking. And one of the tasks we've set ourselves is to try and identify the most important things to fact check each day, because each day we can maybe write one fact check per fact checker. And that means each time we make that choice of what we fact check, it has to be the most important thing. And that's fairly stark when I look at the media that we're monitoring and the technology and the tooling that we've put together, where we're seeing at least 100,000 potential claims to fact check per day. And that's that scoping, that funnel of those to the things we check and then making sure they're seen by as many people as possible. There's a lot of information that flows in multiple ways around this, but I think it's incredibly important to think about how do we use decent web style thinking to think about how do we make sure that information travels as far as it possibly can. And certainly I was really excited to hear Elena mention things like Wikidata, a tremendously important part of this process. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation, Olivier. Where do you want to take us?
Well, I'm going to start with a slightly thought-provoking, or I hope thought-provoking question, and I'm paraphrasing some of the questions I'm seeing in the Q&A. That I hear, well, at least two of you, if not all of you, talk a lot about the quality of information, of getting it to people, which to some extent links to a notion of data and information literacy, which I would like to hear your thoughts on. But what's interesting to me is that the language you've all been using it takes a different tack to what we may hear elsewhere about it being an arms race, about disinformation and misinformation. And I'm going to actually largely stick to misinformation, so the relatively more passive, disinformation being the active, offensive version of it, which is definitely problematic. But to your point, Andy, the volume is largely, there's a varying quality in the volume of claims being made, and some of that is bad, and it's misinformation, it's disinformation. That's it. That's being confused. Misinformation, bad information. And so I wanted to kind of hear about how do we, is it largely what you're telling me, that it is a quality problem, it is not an arms race, it is not an adversarial system, or am I misunderstanding what you're saying? I don't know who wants to pick it up, and I don't know if you've got if we've got consensus in the group about this. Sana, you have spoken first, and you were talking about it being, you know, slightly adversarial. So what's your take on this? Is this a quality problem, or is adversarial, or is it a bit of both?
It's the state of affairs of the world that we're living in today. I mean, I firmly believe, from my perspective, the scarcest resource in the 21st century is human attention. In my role, I see that all the time. I am in a position, along with others in our organization, as many others are, we're trying to compel people to peel off, to not look at so much else that's distracting them, and to find compelling ways of getting them to mobilize in some way, you know, either donate to us or speak out about what we see or work for us. That in itself has been so challenging as it is. Add to that now this cacophony of misinformation and disinformation, our work is becoming increasingly difficult. yeah, I'll keep it at that. That's the real impact of that at the moment. And at the end of the day, it is impacting those who do not have the privilege that we have right now with the people that are gathered here today. I mean, I have to constantly remind myself of what are we doing, the human element of this, the human element of whatever you're bringing up. The Rohingyas, for example, that we work with, the people that flee their conflict areas are compelled to do so with no choice left except to take to the ferocious waters and get in a lifeboat, for example. Anything that we're talking about today or in this larger conversation, even whatever we're doing, you know, is it leading to us sort of tapping ourselves on the back and so that we can sleep better at night? Or is it really making the people that we're trying to help sleep better at night as well? It's a question I ask myself as well. And I think we're nowhere close because of how the environment is today on helping them sleep better at night.
Elena, Andy, do you want to come in there? Elena?
I absolutely agree with Sana about the human element and the human cost of all this, which makes the topic so important and so critical. I would like to talk about the technical part of it, perhaps. And to some degree, I agree with you that it is a certain sense of urgency, but not in the sense of how do we stop this one bit of misinformation from spreading out. That is a problem. At the same time, I think we have an understanding, quite a good understanding of how information spreads virally, and know quite a bit of about those phenomena. What we know less is what to do about it and how to stop it. And practically the same technologies that Andy mentioned earlier, which have proven so beneficial in many contexts, allowing good information to spread, are the same that sometimes allow a piece of malicious content or fake news to spread even faster. I think there is a certain a second time sensitive component to this, which is around the technologies and the standards that we put in place to allow organizations like SANA's and all fact checker teams in the world to work better. And while it is great to see that the big internet platforms of the world do pick up on factually checked information and publish it, at the same time, they do a lot to silo their data and to discourage interoperability. And I don't need to talk too much about the sort of business models that underlie some of these platforms, which go hand in hand with publishing viral content, whatever this viral quality of it might mean. In terms of technologies, I think we have made huge advances with deep learning and other forms of machine learning, with very sophisticated human AI kind of architectures that allow us to check the veracity of information or the provenance of information at a much bigger scale than, say, 5 or 10 years ago. At the same time, we need to be very cautious about these systems and how they are used, and the sort of data that fuels them, because all of this is quite limited, and at the same time, to some degree, also accessible only to certain part of the, let's call it, data economy. So if we're thinking just about the sort of big deep learning, pre-trained deep learning models like GPT-3 and others, which researchers at Stanford recently called foundational models. So if we're thinking about these models that are used, they're very complex with billions and billions of these parameters, pre-trained on huge amounts of data that only certain organizations have access to, both computationally and from an information point of view, then you're basically talking about an automated, about technology that we don't understand as well as we should, about data sets which we collect in an uncontrolled and perhaps even unethical way sometimes, which influence how we make up our mind over a piece of information and how good it is. And just to conclude, there is a human side to that as well, which brings me back to the big internet platforms and the huge scales of content moderation that is happening there through crowdsourcing and other types of services. So the well-being of those communities that are helping out to fact check, to flag different types of information on these platforms is something that I think we would need to look into as well, just like Sana is concerned, and rightfully so, about the impact of misinformation on real communities.
Excellent. I'm going to turn to you, Andy, because there's a lingering question, especially, Elena was talking about the scale and speed of automated moderation, and in your kind of introduction, Andy, you were talking about the fact that you have a lot of automation in the work that you do at full fact, but at the end of the pipeline, so to speak, you have a person who picks the claim that your organization chooses to, so that editorial process of choosing which claims to fact check and then use the data, but with a human in the loop. And I think kind of the underlying question there is for me is, so why isn't that fully automated and thus at complete scale? What can you explain to the audience here, why is it something that you choose or you have tested but decided not to do at full scale, fully automated?
Sure, great question. I think foundationally, humans are amazing. They're incredibly good at processing data very quickly and understanding the nuances of context and caveats, and particularly the position of some information. Machines, natural language processing, machine learning, they're very good at classifying things. They're very good at popping things into buckets. They're very good at ordering and bringing order to chaos. I mean, we find that incredibly useful because we're taking the fire hose of the web and we're trying to organize it into something that has enough structure that a human can get to grips with. And if you can imagine looking at all of the bad information on the web, it is not a pleasant process. So computers are very good at giving that structure. Who said it? Where did they say it? What was it about? And that means we can start to break things down. And then humans are incredibly helpful and just have this innate ability to say, okay, there's some context that needs to be applied to this. There's a caveat. There's some information that is pertinent that I can gather from my own understanding of this. And I think that's often a concern with the use of technology in this kind of spaces where it's attempts to overstep. The idea of fully automating something like fact checking, where it's so potentially riddled with challenges, I think makes me incredibly nervous. I think technology is an incredible empowerer to make sure that we can work faster and better. but that is what it is. It's not a replacement, it is an enabler.
Thank you, Andy. I'm going to now turn to the questions in the sidebar of the event, and there's two that I'm going to mix up a little bit, because one of the questions is about picking and understanding authoritative, trustworthy sources. A really hard question. And there's another question that is about the potential of bridging the digital divide in helping there, and possibly loaded question, and I would absolutely welcome for you to tell me no, that's not how it works. But I'm starting from the hypothesis that we will struggle as humanity will struggle with bad information until we have a population that is aware of minimum media studies, data literacy. Is that doable? Well, desirable, I think we can all agree, although I welcome disagreement on that, but I think it's desirable. But is it doable? And do you think that this is a big part of helping people understand provenance of data, understand the sources, understand the trustworthiness of the information that they see, or do you think that there is another big element that's missing there? Don't know who wants to take this question, or at least start taking this question. Andy, go for it.
I mean, it's a really interesting and big question. Digital data literacy has a component to this, absolutely, for sure. I think it's important to remember that misinformation, disinformation can tie deeply into people's belief systems and thinking about the way these things are intermediated. So a proverbial internet platform just saying somebody that you're wrong isn't necessarily the easiest way of engaging with something. So making sure the stuff is presented contextually, making sure it is supportive, making sure it's available for people to find out more information, help them on a journey. People are their belief systems are made up of many different things, and they are complicated. And I think certainly that's one of the things that ties back into fact checking. The fact checking isn't about just publishing something and hoping there is a change in the world. Part of our work in full fact certainly is every time we do a fact check, we ask somebody to correct the record. That's important because there's a further action. And it's always important to think about the wider systems that it fits into. So is this legislation, policies, terms for platforms, and is this about widespread digital and data literacy? It is a spectrum. There is no one thing that solves all of this, but we're describing fairly briefly huge chunks of things that are needed to be addressed to deal with a genuinely societal problem.
Thank you. We're entering the last 5 minutes of our session, and so I'm going to ask each of you in turn a really quick answer to one of the questions that we've got in the Q&A. That might not be easy, but I'm trusting you to come up with something pithy and powerful. I'm going to start with you, Elena. You mentioned earlier citizen science as a really interesting domain of creating data and involving citizens. What would you say is the importance of citizen science in solving dis and misinformation?
Hey, I think it's a huge opportunity. And I mean here not just citizen journalism, which probably Andy and Sana know much more about than me, but actually getting involved in science. So there is a I would say utilitarian aspect to it, which is really that human in the loop contribution that helps scientists like me train algorithms to make sense of the huge amounts of information that we work with in different sciences. But there is a second aspect, and there is evidence for that people who get involved in scientific projects, for instance, by taking measurements in their backyards or just measuring the level of light pollution on their streets and reporting it, also learn how to think as a scientist. And how do we think like scientists? Well, we doubt everything, but hopefully in a constructive way. So doubt is something that helps us look at a piece of information twice and understand that for whatever reasons, it might not always be true, or it might not be true right now, and it was true yesterday, and then make decisions accordingly. And I think that's something that is crucially important and very much ties into that data literacy aspect you have mentioned earlier.
Brilliant, Elena. Good template, excellent answer, quick, perfect. Andy, no pressure, but I'm going to ask you next a slightly more technical question. So Bharat Sharma in the audience asks, what could we, and by we he means NHS Digital, he or she, my apologies, what could we do better to support reuse of information for fact checking?
Okay, well, that is an impossible quick answer, but broadly speaking, get in touch. We're always interested to talk about people. And think about what good information looks like. It needs to be openly published. It needs to be openly licensed. It needs to be descriptive. It needs to have any appropriate context and caveats applied to it so we can understand how it can be used. We need to understand how it fits into a wider system. What were the people thinking when they created this information? And what can we compare it to? It's really important for us to understand, can we cross-reference this with some other seemingly similar data? And also to think about how it might be weaponized, who is looking at this information, and what might they do if you didn't apply the appropriate disclaimers around it. So think about the good actors, and also very importantly, think about the bad actors who might use that information.
Brilliant, thank you, Andy. Sana, I'm turning to you with a really tough question, which is, it's an anonymous question that it's really quick question, but probably deserves a long answer. What is more dangerous, in your opinion and your experience, misinformation or disinformation? And I picked this because I kind of brushed off the question of misinformation and disinformation and said, well, we're just going to talk about misinformation, but disinformation, the act of creating bad information, is real, and you talked about that. Would you say, especially in the context of the discussion we've just had, that the focus on misinformation is right, or would you say that disinformation is a more dangerous problem?
That is a tough one to answer, and I don't think there is. I don't want to get into this situation of giving absolutes here either. Both of them warrant a serious, hard look, and they both work. They're effective. That's what we're seeing, is that they're both effective. We have to find, those of us, this coalition of the willing, trying to get ahead of this, have to find effective ways of how to battle both of those, so that question doesn't come up maybe the next time you have this summit, you know. And I just want to also mention here that we need a multidisciplinary approach. So many of us, I'm realizing, being in this group of excellent people here, in our little bubble, we're struggling, you know, to get ahead of misinformation and disinformation and how it impacts human beings, while so many others are far ahead in this process. We really need a multidisciplinary approach to be able to make meaningful impact here. And I hope that we can get closer to that soon.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Sana. You're ending perfectly on a call to action. I would echo that. I think I'm really happy to have had the three of you on the panel today, kind of showcasing difference of perspectives from the fact-checking, the research and the inquiry, and being on the ground and fighting it every day. I will leave us all today with that kind of notion that, if not a panacea, if not a perfect solution, the notion of creating and engaging with the public to create and disseminate better information might not be the solution, but it's definitely a solution. And so I was delighted to have a chance to talk disinformation, misinformation, and good data with all three of you. Sana, Andy, Elena, thank you very much for joining me on this panel.